21 years ago this week, the Supreme Court of Canada issued its decision in the Marshall case, confirming that the treaties of 1760-61 protect the Mi'kmaq right to fish and sell it. It's called the Marshall case because it was Donald Marshall Jr., a Mi'kmaq man who had been charged for catching and selling eels without a license under federal regulations. Marshall is also the same man who had been wrongfully imprisoned for over a decade for a crime he didn't commit, simply because he was Native. 21 years later, and prisons are full of Native peoples, and Mi'kmaq peoples are still denied their right to fish and sell it. So stay tuned to learn more about the legacy of Mi'kmaq warrior Donald Marshall Jr. and the violent racist attacks happening against our Mi'kmaq fishers this week. Welcome back, warriors. Kwe Tanse Sego. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater, and welcome to my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us save our peoples and the planet. It was 21 years ago this week that the Supreme Court of Canada issued its decision which acquitted Donald Marshall Jr. of all charges of fishing and selling eels without a federal license. But before we get into the details of the Marshall case, it's important for you to know who Donald Marshall Jr. was and the risks he took to protect the rights of our people in the Mi'kmaq Nation. Donald Marshall Jr. was born in Mi'kma'ki on the Membertou First Nation and was the son of Mi'kmaq Nation Grand Chief Donald Marshall Sr. At the young age of 17, Donald Marshall was wrongfully arrested and then prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison in 1971 for a murder he didn't commit. Marshall ultimately spent over a decade in prison. And even when the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal finally acquitted Marshall of all charges in 1983, the presiding judge blamed Marshall, saying that he was the, quote, author of his own misfortune. This grave miscarriage of justice resulted in the Royal Commission on the Donald Marshall Jr. prosecution, which released its report in 1989. The commission specifically condemned those statements about Marshall being the author of his own misfortune. They also went on to make what they called inescapable conclusions that were also inescapably distressing. And I quote, "The criminal justice system failed Donald Marshall Jr. at virtually every turn, from his arrest and wrongful conviction for murder in 1971 up to and even beyond his acquittal by the Court of Appeal in 1983. The tragedy of the failure is compounded by evidence that this miscarriage of justice could and should have been prevented, or at least corrected quickly, if those involved in the system had carried out their duties in a professional and/or competent manner. That they did not is due in part at least to the fact that Donald Marshall Jr. is a Native. This report, like so many others, has confirmed what we already knew, that the entire justice system is infected with racism against Native peoples. Yet despite losing 11 years of his life to a racist justice system stacked against Native peoples, Donald Marshall Jr., at great personal risk, stepped forward to defend our Mi'kmaq right to fish and sell it. While Marshall asserted his treaty right to fish and sell it under the treaties of 1760-61, he was nevertheless charged and convicted at trial with 3 offenses under the federal fisheries regulations, and the Court of Appeal upheld those convictions. The Supreme Court of Canada allowed Marshall's appeal and acquitted him on all charges. They found that the courts below had interpreted the treaty in such a way as to leave the Mi'kmaq with an empty shell of a treaty promise, something that did not uphold the honor of the Crown. As a result, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the treaty right to fish, hunt, gather, and trade or sell those goods to make a moderate livelihood. Yet despite this ruling, neither the federal government nor the provincial governments or even law enforcement and local Native fishermen have respected these constitutionally protected Mi'kmaq rights. Instead, the federal government has dealt in bad faith with Mi'kmaq leaders and pressured them into signing agreements to surrender our rights in return for a pittance. And it must be kept in mind that our Mi'kmaq nation never ceded or surrendered our lands, waters, or resources, and that includes the fisheries. The question isn't one of how to accommodate our interests, but how the Mi'kmaq might choose to accommodate the privilege of non-native fishers in our waters. The resource has always been part of our sovereign jurisdiction. But Canada's starvation policies, political bullying, and threats of law enforcement and incarceration have kept our people out of our own economies and impoverished. The federal government cannot claim that there is a single First Nation community that is part of the Mi'kmaq Nation in all of Mi'kma'ki that can claim that all of its members make a moderate livelihood from fisheries. In contrast, local non-native fishermen rake in millions of dollars and have overfished our waters for decades. What is worse is that recently these same non-native fishermen have responded to Sipekne'katik's assumption of jurisdiction over their own fisheries with racist acts of violence to try to stop Mi'kmaq peoples from exercising our rights. Our rights are not limited to one Supreme Court of Canada case on treaty rights to fish. We also have constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights and a pre-existing inherent right based on our collective sovereignty and jurisdiction over all of our unceded territories and waters according to our own laws. Our Mi'kmaq laws have never been ceded, surrendered, or extinguished, and are now also protected at the international level in various human rights treaties, conventions, and declarations which Canada has ratified. It's also important to keep in mind that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples specifically recognizes and protects our rights as the Mi'kmaq Nation to be self-determining and autonomous, to govern all of our traditional lands and resources, and the right to control, manage, and benefit our resources. Non-native fishermen have no constitutional right to fish, and they don't have a constitutional right to engage in commercial fisheries. They are merely granted the privilege to do so from the Crown. And these non-native fishermen also do not have internationally protected rights or rights under Mi'kmaq law to use our resources without our free, prior, and informed consent. Yet many of them have overfished for their own economic profit and now engage in racialized violence to keep us out of our own waters. Non-native fishermen, many identifying as Acadians and flying Acadian flags on their boats, have been engaged in the following acts of racism and violence towards Mi'kmaq peoples this week. Illegal and violent protests, making racist slurs and threats against Mi'kmaq peoples, destroying Mi'kmaq lobster traps and property, and trying to ram Mi'kmaq boats and shooting at them with flare guns. These are all violent crimes and hate crimes, and there should have been swift arrests by police of these Acadian fishers and anyone acting in this way towards Mi'kmaq peoples. As a result of the increasing racism and violence against Mi'kmaq peoples by these non-native fishers, the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq chiefs have declared a state of emergency for all of mainland Nova Scotia, which may also be extended to Cape Breton if needed. They are establishing an emergency command center and will be present on the ground to support our Mi'kmaq fishers. This emergency order is in place until Tuesday, September 22nd at 5 p.m. unless it needs to be extended. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs has issued a statement in full support of the Mi'kmaq Nation and strongly condemns the unlawful acts of violence against our fishers. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs has also issued unconditional support to the Mi'kmaq Nation and also condemns the violence of these non-native fishermen. The Native Women's Association of Canada has written an open letter to the Prime Minister calling on him and his government to take urgent action to protect the Mi'kmaq fishers and to once and for all respect and implement Mi'kmaq treaty rights. NWAC further calls on DFO Minister Bernadette Jordan to apologize to the Mi'kmaq for her inappropriate comments about our rights. Mi'kmaq Senators Dan Christmas and Brian Francis further make an open call to Canada to respect the Mi'kmaq treaty rights upheld in the Marshall case. And both senators emphasize that there will be no reconciliation until our rights are respected. And many other groups and organizations are also coming forward. I think it's also important to note that there is nothing in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Minister's mandate letter from Trudeau that makes engaging with First Nations a priority on implementing our inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights in relations to fisheries management and benefit. And what makes matters worse is that this isn't the first time we as the Mi'kmaq have had to deal with racism, violence, and dispossession of our resources from governments, corporations, and some segments of society. In 1981, the SQ made 2 violent raids on the Mi'kmaq at Listuguj to stop them from managing their own fisheries, and this resulted in numerous injuries of Mi'kmaq peoples and arrests. In 1998, Quebec again tried to stop the Mi'kmaq at Listuguj from benefiting from timber in their own territory. Between 1999 and 2001, at various points, non-native fishermen engaged in the same acts of racism, violence, and property destruction against Mi'kmaq peoples at Esconobidij, formerly known as Burnt Church, simply because they were exercising their treaty right to fish, one that had been proven at the Supreme Court in the Marshall case. Even Fisheries and Oceans, DFO, and the RCMP joined in the violence and ran over Mi'kmaq boats and beat Mi'kmaq peoples in the water who literally had to jump out of their boats to survive. In 2013, hundreds of heavily armed RCMP and snipers moved into Mi'kmaq territory in Elsipekne'katik to force hydrofracking on our lands without our free, prior and informed consent. And in addition to these ongoing attacks on our Mi'kmaq rights, our people have had to withstand racism, threats of arrest, and violence in relation to stopping Alton Gas from poisoning our rivers, and stopping the ongoing contamination at Boat Harbor. I stand with Sipekne'katik and their assertion of their right to govern their own fisheries. Mi'kmaq peoples have a right to govern our lands, our waters, and our resources according to our own laws, and these rights have never been respected. While I am from Ugbaganjig, a Mi'kmaq First Nation in New Brunswick known as Eel River Bar First Nation, we are all still part of the same sovereign Mi'kmaq nation. We are all one people, and we respect within the Mi'kmaq nation that we are from different families, communities, districts, and now even provincial lines. But we have always been one nation. Even after signing treaties with the Crown in relation to peace and friendship, military allyship, and trade, they still enacted scalping bounties to try to force Mi'kmaq peoples from our own lands. We have since been forced from our lands, forced out of our traditional economies, and forced into poverty by the greed of colonial governments, corporations, and some segments of society. And it's long past time to make reparations for historic and ongoing genocide and violence against our peoples and finally restore justice to Mi'kmaq peoples in Mi'kma'ki. And that means the status quo cannot go on. Those who benefit from the spoils of genocide, dispossession, and oppression have no standing to challenge our birthrights. Donald Marshall Jr.'s life was forever changed by being wrongfully imprisoned because of racism in Canada's justice system. But our lives will be forever changed by the risks that Donald Marshall took to protect our treaty rights to fish and engage in a livelihood. These current acts of racism and violence dishonor Donald Marshall Jr. If Canada wants to move forward in reconciliation with Mi'kmaq peoples, it must first honor the legacy of Donald Marshall Jr. and respect the rights that he sacrificed for. Warrior friends, everyone who is watching this time I'm calling on you to help support my nation, the Mi'kmaq. Please take some time to send emails to your local municipal, provincial, and federal representatives, ministers, premiers, and the Prime Minister to show your support for the Mi'kmaq. And do what you can to share this video on social media, within your universities, classes, organizations, and community groups. The Mi'kmaq have also posted a list of ways that you can support them, including following Mi'kmaq people and journalists to ensure that you get all the facts. People like Chief Michael Cheryl Maloney, Maureen Gugu, all the Mi'kmaq chiefs, the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, Mi'kmaq lawyers, journalists, and community members, and those fishers who are on the ground and who have taken to social media to make sure that those Mi'kmaq fishers are protected and that we have eyes and ears on the scenes. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the action that you're going to take. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.